I was in the middle of renewing our Transport Canada carrier profile, the kind of paperwork that takes 3 browser tabs, 2 passwords, and 1 very stale cup of coffee, when my phone buzzed with a calendar invite. Not a meeting request, a calendar block titled Transition Discussion, HR plus Leadership, scheduled for the next morning at 9 a.m. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I closed my laptop, put on my coat, and drove home in the kind of silence where you're not really listening to the radio even though it's on. I'd been with the company for 19 years. 19 years of early mornings and late calls and weekends spent recertifying for licenses that most people in that building couldn't name, let alone hold. I was the compliance and regulatory lead for a mid-sized freight and logistics company out of Mississauga. We moved goods across provinces and into the States. The paperwork alone could fill a room. And I was the one who filled it. My wife noticed the moment I walked in. She looked at me over the kitchen counter and said, "What happened?" I told her about the calendar invite. She didn't say anything for a second. Then she said, "Is this about the new guy?" She meant the new VP of Operations. He'd arrived 4 months earlier from a tech-adjacent consulting firm in Vancouver, mid-40s, with a very confident way of explaining things he didn't fully understand. He had slides. He always had slides. In a second week, he'd done a presentation on operational streamlining that used the phrase legacy overhead 4 times. I counted. The 4th time he looked directly at me. I wasn't imagining it. 2 of my colleagues noticed, and one of them texted me afterward, "Did he just?" The answer was yes, he just did. The morning meeting was short. HR, the VP, and a woman from legal I'd never met before. They used phrases like role restructuring and evolving operational needs and a shift towards centralized digital compliance management. I sat there with my hands flat on the table and let them finish. When they were done, I asked one question. Does the new compliance structure account for the carrier licenses? The VP said, "We're bringing in a third-party platform to manage all of that going forward." I nodded slowly. I said, "Okay." I didn't say anything else. I signed the separation agreement, collected my personal items over the following 2 days, and left. What I didn't mention, what nobody thought to ask about, was that 14 of those carrier licenses were issued under my name. Personally, not the company's name. Mine. Let me explain how that happens, because I get asked about it a lot. In Canada, certain federal operating authorities, particularly those issued under Transport Canada for cross-border and inter-provincial freight, can be held by an individual rather than a corporation, depending on when they were filed and under which regulatory framework. Over the years, especially in the early 2000s when I was building the compliance infrastructure from scratch, several of our most critical operating licenses got filed under my name because I was the applicant of record, and no one at the time thought to set up a corporate holding structure for them. It was a documentation gap that I flagged twice in internal memos, in 2009 and again in 2014, and both times it was acknowledged and both times nothing changed because there were other priorities. I kept copies of those memos. I also kept copies of everything else. 19 years of compliance documentation, renewal histories, audit records, carrier profile backups, CVOR abstracts, NSC certificates, and interprovincial operating authority filings. Not because I was planning anything. I kept them because that's what a compliance professional does. You document, you archive, you make sure the record exists somewhere safe. The third-party platform the VP had contracted, I looked it up that week, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, was a software tool designed for small fleets, automated renewal reminders, digital filing, clean interface. It was genuinely a good product for a company running 30 local delivery vans. We were running 140 units across 4 provinces and into Michigan and Minnesota. I didn't say anything to anyone. I went for walks. I helped my younger son with a school project about the Great Lakes. I rescheduled a dentist appointment I'd been putting off for 8 months. I cooked dinner 3 nights in a row, which my wife said was either wonderful or deeply alarming. The call came on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after my last day. It was my former supervisor, not the VP. but the operations director who'd worked alongside me for 11 years. He called from his personal cell, which told me everything before he said a word. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want to be upfront that I'm not calling on behalf of the company officially." I said, "Go ahead." He told me that Transport Canada had flagged 3 of the carrier licenses during a routine cross-border compliance check. The system had tried to process a renewal filing and it had bounced back because the licensees of record were registered to an individual, me, who was no longer listed as an authorized representative of the company. The platform couldn't resolve it. The legal team had spent 2 days trying to resolve it internally and had concluded that without my direct involvement, the licenses could not be transferred or renewed in the current filing cycle. There was a federal audit scheduled in 11 days. He didn't tell me that part directly. I found it out later. But I could hear it underneath everything he was saying. He asked me if I'd be willing to come in and help sort it out. I was quiet for a moment. Not because I was being dramatic. I just needed to think clearly. I said, I'd need to come in as a consultant, not as an employee, with a contract. He said he'd have to run it up the chain. I said, I understand. Take your time. He called back in 4 hours. The VP wanted to speak with me directly. I agreed to a call. The VP was different on that call than he'd ever been in any meeting I'd attended. He was careful, precise. He used none of the buzzwords. He explained the situation a bit differently than my former supervisor had, smoothing over some of the sharper edges, and asked if I could consult on a short-term basis to help bridge the transition. I asked about the scope of the engagement. He described it. It was, by any reasonable measure, my old job, or the most critical parts of it. I named my consulting rate. It was 2.5 times my former salary, prorated daily. There was a silence on the line. He said, That's significantly above what we'd anticipated. I said, I understand. I'm available if the terms work for you. Another silence. He said they'd get back to me. They called back the next morning. They agreed to the rate. They also agreed to a 60-day minimum engagement, which I'd built into my terms. I drove back into that building on a Monday. I wore the same jacket I'd worn to every audit for the past decade. The receptionist, who'd been there almost as long as I had, smiled at me and said, I knew they'd call. I said, How long did you give them? She said, 6 weeks. I was off by 2 days. The work itself wasn't complicated, not for me. I knew exactly which licenses needed to be novated, which required Transport Canada's direct sign-off, and which could be resolved through an updated authorization filing with supporting documentation. I knew the names of the regional compliance officers. I'd worked with 2 of them for over a decade. One of them, when I called, said, Oh, you're back? And I said, briefly, and she laughed like she knew exactly what that meant. I resolved the 3 flag licenses in 4 days. I could have done it in 2. I took 4 because I also needed to set up a proper corporate holding structure for the remaining 11 licenses, so this wouldn't happen again. Not for their sake, for mine, because my name was on those documents and I wasn't going to leave things half done. On day 8, I had a conversation with the legal team's outside counsel, a woman I'd dealt with on previous audits, and she asked me, off the record, whether I'd had any idea this situation would arise when I signed the separation agreement. I told her honestly that I hadn't planned for it. I'd flagged the documentation gap twice over the years and nothing had been done. When I left cleanly. I didn't structure anything to create leverage. She nodded and said, The memos. I said, Yes. She said, That's actually what makes this defensible from your side. You raised it. It's documented. Nobody can claim you withheld material information. I said, I know. She looked at me for a moment and then said, You've done this before, haven't you? I said, Done what? She smiled and let it go. The federal audit came and went without incident. The transport auditor, a man I'd met twice before at industry conferences, went through our carrier profile, our NSC safety fitness certificate, our cross-border authority documentation, our driver logs, and the CVOR abstract. Everything was in order. He spent most of his time in the back office reviewing filing histories and came out 2 hours later and said we were clear. The VP shook his hand at the door. Then he came and found me in the compliance office, my old office, which still had my filing system because no one had changed it, and said, "Good work." I said, "Thank you." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was comfortable and then left. I found out later, from my former supervisor who kept me updated on things I hadn't asked about, that the VP's centralized digital compliance platform project had been quietly deprioritized after the audit. No announcement. It just stopped being mentioned in leadership meetings. My 60-day engagement ended on a Wednesday. I drove home, stopped at the Tim Hortons on the way, and got a large dark roast. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes and drank it while the traffic moved on Derry Road. My wife asked me that evening if I'd miss it. I thought about it genuinely. The work, yes. Certain colleagues, yes. The building, the parking garage, the fluorescent lights in the break room, none of that. I told her I thought I was fine. She said, "You don't look like someone who just finished a hard job. You look like someone who just finished a job that should have been finished a long time ago." She was right, like she usually is. I've been doing independent consulting since then. Transport compliance, carrier licensing, cross-border authority filings for companies that are serious about getting it right the first time. I set my own hours. I work from the kitchen table in the morning and take my younger son to hockey on Thursday evenings without having to check a calendar or clear it with anyone. Last fall, a former colleague I'd worked with in the Mississauga office reached out. She'd moved to a smaller regional carrier in Barrie and was building their compliance function from scratch. She asked if I'd come on board part-time to set up their framework. I said yes. It was exactly the kind of work I'd always preferred. Building something properly from the ground up with people who understood why it mattered. I'm not angry about how things ended at the old company. Not anymore, and honestly, not that much even at the time. What happened was the result of a decision made by someone who didn't understand what he was looking at. That's not unusual. It happens in a lot of industries. Someone arrives with a new vocabulary and an appetite for quick results, and the things that took years to build quietly get reclassified as inefficiency. The paperwork doesn't stop being important because someone decided to stop reading it. I spent 19 years making sure that company could move freight across this country legally, safely, and without incident. Nobody got hurt, no shipments were seized, no licenses were suspended, no audit ever came back with a critical finding. That record doesn't disappear because my name got taken off an org chart. The morning I cleaned out my office. The first time when I was let go, I took one thing off the wall. It was a small framed notice from Transport Canada, the original confirmation of our National Safety Code certification, dated from the year I'd filed it. My name was in the bottom right corner as applicant of record. It's on my desk at home now, next to the window that looks out onto the backyard. Some mornings, when the light comes in at a certain angle and I'm starting on the first of what will probably be too many coffees, I look at it and think about all the freight that moved across this country because the paperwork was done right. That's enough for me. There's a framed Transport Canada notice sitting on my desk right now. I can see it from where I'm typing this. My name is in the bottom right corner, applicant of record, dated from a year when most of the people who later called me redundant hadn't even heard of our company yet. I look at it sometimes and think about cause and effect, not in any mystical sense, just the plain mechanical kind. You make a decision. That decision produces a result. The result produces another decision. It goes on like that. What happened to me wasn't fate. It was just consequence, moving at its own pace. The VP, who called me legacy overhead, wasn't a bad person. I want to be honest about that. He was someone who'd learned to speak fluently in a language that prioritized disruption over continuity, speed over depth. He looked at my work and saw paper. He didn't see the 19 years of judgment embedded in that paper. That's not a moral failing so much as a failure of attention. And attention, I've come to believe, is one of the most underrated forms of competence there is, knowing what something actually is before you decide what to do with it. That takes patience. It takes the willingness to sit with complexity instead of streamlining it away. I'd spent nearly 2 decades doing work that required all 3 things I think matter most in any professional life. Doing the job honestly even when no one was watching. understanding the system well enough to know where the real risks were, and staying the course through the years when the work felt invisible. None of those things showed up in a performance metric. None of them made it into the VP's slides. But all of them were present in those 14 licenses. All of them were present in the memos I'd written in 2009 and 2014, flagging the very gap that would eventually bring him back to my kitchen table, hat in hand. What I want people to take from this, if anything, is that the work itself has a kind of integrity that outlasts whoever is currently deciding whether it matters. I didn't hold on to those licenses as a strategy. I built that documentation archive because it was the right thing to do. I raised those concerns in writing because that's what honest professionals do, even when they suspect nothing will come of it. And when the moment came where all of that mattered enormously, I didn't have to scramble. I just had to show up. Raymond called me on a Thursday morning from his personal cell. That detail still means something to me. Not the company line. His own phone. That's how you know the situation has moved past official channels and into the territory where real consequences are landing on real people. I felt for him. I still do. He'd been a good colleague for 11 years, and he was caught between an institutional mess and a VP who'd made promises the software couldn't keep. I named my rate, and I held it. Not out of bitterness, out of accuracy. That's what the work was worth. That's what 19 years of unglamorous, careful, consequential compliance work was worth on the open market. If anything, I think I could have asked for more. The 60 days ended on a Wednesday. I stopped at Tim Hortons on the way home, the one on Derry Road I'd been going to for years. Large, dark roast. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes and watched the traffic. My name is still on those documents. It'll be there for years. Long after everyone involved has moved on to other companies, other titles, other slides. That's enough.